Okay, this is the FRQ for Unit 2. So what I want you guys to do is get out your FRQ in your interactive notebooks, and you are going to make all corrections that need to be done. Okay, obviously if you got a 100, then you're skipping this step. But everyone else, we're going to go through this entire thing. You are going to correct your work. And then once you're done with that, you are going to write your reflection in your notebook based off of this FRQ. When we're done with this, you are going to go on to Schoology, find another FRQ that's posted in today's folder, complete that, and turn it in by Monday at 11:59. Okay, so this one says, imagine you are a marketing analyst for a chain of retail stores. Your task is to evaluate the effectiveness of advertising campaigns on sales revenue. The company has been tracking its advertising spending and corresponding sales revenue over the past 20 months. The data is shown in the table below. So we have our table, advertising spending, sales revenue. We have our computer output here. And then we have our scatter plot and our residual plot. So the first question here says, what are the explanatory and response variables in this setting? So you would say that the explanatory variable is the advertising spending, and the response is the sales revenue. You got 1 point for doing that. The next question says, explain why this relationship makes sense. Well, it says the relationship makes sense because you would expect the amount you spend on advertising to have an impact on sales revenue. Okay, you got the second point for doing that. The next question says, describe the relationship between advertising spending and sales revenue. Remember, when it's telling you to describe the relationship, it's looking for three things. So you should have wrote that there is a strong, positive, linear relationship between advertising spending and sales revenue. Okay, this was 1 point. Part C says, find and interpret the slope of the least squares regression line. Okay, so in order to find slope, we'd go over here to our computer output. I know that where it says constant, that is my y-intercept, and everything else, so in this case spending, would be my slope. So my slope is 3.0104. So going back over here to answer that, I would say slope equals 3.0104. Okay, that was 1 point. Then it says interpret this. So you should have said for every $1,000 the company spends on advertising, their sales revenue is expected to increase, this was important, expected to increase by $3,010.40. Very important that you wrote it like this and you didn't write expected to increase by 3.0104. Okay, that was a point. The next part says, does it appear that a linear model is appropriate for this data? Explain. Well, a lot of you almost had it, except you weren't very specific in your wording, so I couldn't give you the point. What you should have done is you should have went up to your residual plot and you should have been asking yourself, well, is there a pattern? Okay. If you say no, then you know it's appropriate. If you say yes, then it's not appropriate. Another thing you could look at is your R value. So this is R squared, which means our R value would be equal to the square root of 0.743, which is equal to 0.862. However, it is not enough to indicate just the correlation value. You would have to describe the residual plot as well. So we would say, yes, the data is randomly scattered on the residual plot, showing no pattern. Okay, that would be enough. Okay, you could have added the R value. You could have added something about the scatter plot, but the most important thing is I was looking for a residual plot. So that was 1 point. Lastly, it says, find and interpret the residual for the month where the company spent $19,000 on advertising. Okay, well, when the company spent $19,000, if we go over to our table, we see our table is in thousands of dollars. So we need to find the value that is just 19, and that's this value here. So X is 19, Y is 108. So I'm going to write that over here. X is 19, and Y is 108. Okay. We could also look at the table, and based off the y-intercept and the slope, we could do our y-hat equation. So y-hat is equal to 3.0104x plus 57.437. This was 1 point. Then you had to plug in those values to find your y-hat value. So y-hat is equal to 3.0104 times 19 plus 57.437. This would give us 114.63. Okay. Sorry, let me rephrase this. This was the first point. Okay. Then in order to calculate your residual, okay, we know residual is y minus y hat. Well, y is 108 and y hat is 114.63, which means we got a residual of negative 6.63. That was 1 point. The last point was actually writing out your interpretation. So you would say, we predicted that if we spend $19,000 on advertising, we would make $114,630 in sales revenue, but we only actually made $108,000 which is $6,630 lower than expected. That is 1 point. So it should be, let's see, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Maybe I'm missing a couple points. Give me 1 minute. Okay. Okay, so Part A was 2 points. Part B was 1 point. Part C was actually 3 points. So you actually, instead of this being worth 1 point, this was worth 2 points. Part D was worth 2 points. That's my bad. And then Part E was worth those 3 points like I mentioned.